quilt disappeared before I had finished thanking the last person who came to my wife's funeral. I wish I were exaggerating. By late afternoon, the casseroles had already begun filling the kitchen counters. Sympathy cards covered the dining room table, and the house had settled into the heavy silence that always follows a crowded day of mourning. I climbed the stairs simply because I couldn't bear another minute of smiling politely at people telling me Margaret was in a better place. If you've ever discovered that the people we love sometimes protect us by keeping one final secret, stay with me. Our bedroom looked exactly as we had left it before leaving for church that morning, except for one impossible detail. The quilt was gone. Not just any quilt. Margaret had spent nearly 30 years making it by hand. Every square had come from an old piece of our family's life. One patch came from my Army field jacket after I retired from the Corps of Engineers. Another had once been Emily's favorite blue Sunday dress. There were pieces from our son's Little League uniform, Margaret's wedding blouse, my father's flannel shirt, and even a faded dish towel from the first apartment we ever rented after I came home from Germany. People admired that quilt. Margaret never let anyone borrow it. It isn't just fabric, she'd always tell them with a smile. It's our family remembering itself. She kept it folded neatly across the foot of our bed every single day. Now the cedar chest beneath the window stood open, empty. At first I blamed myself. Army engineering teaches you to verify facts before reaching conclusions. I'd spent decades inspecting bridges, temporary structures, and disaster recovery sites. Memory was useful, but measurements were better. So I checked every room. The guest bedroom, the linen closet, the laundry room. Even the cedar closet downstairs, where Margaret stored winter blankets. Nothing. I returned upstairs more slowly. The empty chest looked different the second time, not because of what was missing, because of what remained. One tiny strand of blue thread rested against the cedar wood. I picked it up carefully. It wasn't torn. It had been cut. That bothered me more than the missing quilt. Margaret never cut loose threads. She tucked every stitch back into place. I slipped the thread into my shirt pocket without really knowing why. Old habits die slowly. Evidence first, opinions later. Just then, Emily appeared quietly in the bedroom doorway. She looked exhausted. Red eyes. Hair still pinned from the funeral. "Dad?" I turned toward her. "The quilt's gone." She hesitated for barely a second. "Oh, I meant to tell you. You know where it is? I took it home." The answer came too quickly. I studied her face the same way I used to study cracked concrete after a flood. Not searching for guilt. Looking for stress. She folded her arms. "I was worried about the fabric. People kept touching it after the visitation yesterday. I thought it would be safer if I cleaned it properly and stored it in my attic until things settled down." It sounded reasonable. Margaret herself worried constantly about preserving old cloth. Still, you could have asked. Emily lowered her eyes. "I know. I'm sorry. I just wasn't thinking straight." Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Then she added something that settled strangely in my mind. "I'll bring it back before the reunion." The reunion. 3 weeks away. Margaret had insisted the entire family gather every July beneath that quilt. Even during chemotherapy, even when she struggled to stand. She never explained why that tradition mattered so much. I nodded slowly. All right. Emily hugged me before leaving. The bedroom fell silent again. Only after she was gone did I notice something else inside the empty cedar chest. Caught beneath one brass hinge was another tiny piece of blue thread. Except this one wasn't loose. It was still attached to a stitch. Someone hadn't simply moved Margaret's quilt. Someone had opened it. I waited until the following afternoon before driving to Emily's house. Not because I believed her explanation completely. Because 32 years in Army engineering had taught me that acting too quickly usually destroyed the very evidence you hoped to understand. Emily greeted me with an uncertain smile before I even reached the porch. I already have coffee ready. She knew me well enough to recognize that coffee usually meant I wanted answers without starting a fight. Her attic occupied the entire upper floor of an old farmhouse she and her husband had restored years earlier. Plastic storage bins lined both walls. Christmas decorations sat neatly labeled, and family photo albums filled a long cedar shelf beneath the window. The quilt rested alone across a folding table. Relief washed over me. At least it still existed. Emily carefully unfolded it. I haven't washed it yet. I wanted to ask someone at church about preserving older stitching first. That sounded exactly like Margaret. She always insisted old fabric had its own rules. I ran my fingertips gently across the familiar squares. The blue patch from Emily's childhood dress, my faded army jacket, our son's baseball uniform. Every memory still seemed exactly where it belonged. Until I turned one corner over. Someone had opened nearly 6 inches of hand stitching, then sewn it closed again. Poorly. Margaret's stitches were tiny, even, almost invisible. These were hurried, uneven. Different thread. Emily leaned closer. I didn't do that. I know. She looked surprised. You believe me? I believe you would have admitted it. She sat quietly, then whispered something that sounded more ashamed than defensive. I did notice it. When? The night I brought it home. Why didn't you tell me? I thought maybe Mom had repaired it herself years ago. Margaret would never have left workmanship like this behind. Emily knew that as well as I did. She reached beneath the folding table and handed me a small paper envelope. I found this on the floor when I unfolded the quilt. Inside rested 3 tiny fragments of yellowed paper. Not enough to read, just brittle edges with faded ink. My heartbeat slowed. Paper. Inside the quilt. Margaret had hidden something there. Carefully. Years ago. I looked back toward the damaged seam. Using the small flashlight I carried on my keychain, I angled the light beneath the loosened stitches. There was another layer of fabric underneath. A hidden lining. Emily stared. I never knew that was there. Neither had I. Not in 48 years of marriage. We examined the remaining stitching together without speaking. The compartment continued far beyond the damaged section. It stretched nearly the entire length of one side. Whatever Margaret had hidden, there had once been much more than 3 paper fragments. Emily swallowed hard. Dad, what if somebody else opened it before I brought it home? That possibility had been quietly growing in my mind since yesterday. Visitors had filled our house after Margaret passed. Friends, neighbors, relatives, church members. Most came only to comfort us. But someone may have noticed what no one else ever had: the hidden stitching. I folded the quilt carefully. Then something caught my eye near one corner: a tiny embroidered bluebird. Margaret had sewn dozens of birds over the years, but never inside this quilt. This one looked newer. Its wing covered a patch stitched with noticeably darker blue thread, almost like a marker. Not decoration. A sign. I remembered hearing Margaret laughing with her quilting friends years earlier. Every family, she'd said, needs something worth passing down besides money. At the time, I thought she meant the quilt itself. Standing in Emily's attic, I realized she may never have been talking about the fabric at all. Just before we carried the quilt downstairs, Emily quietly touched my arm. "Dad," I called. "Mrs. Ruth Caldwell this morning." I looked at her. "What did she say?" Emily hesitated. "She said, if you came looking, she still wasn't allowed to tell you." The next morning, I drove to St. Matthew's Church carrying the quilt in the back seat of my pickup. I left it folded inside a clean cotton sheet, the same way Margaret always transported it to quilting exhibitions. If someone had hidden 40 years of family history inside those stitches, I wasn't about to let one more thread come loose. Ruth Caldwell was already sitting on the church porch. At 83, she had become smaller than I remembered, but her blue eyes still carried the quiet confidence of someone who had spent a lifetime listening more than speaking. She smiled when I climbed the steps. "I knew you'd come." "You knew?" She nodded. "Margaret said you wouldn't stop asking questions once you noticed the bluebird." That answer stopped me. So she planned this. In her own way. I placed the wrapped quilt across the wooden bench between us. "Ruth, what's inside this quilt?" She rested one weathered hand gently on the cotton covering, but didn't unfold it. I promised Margaret I wouldn't answer that question. I buried my wife 3 days ago. I know. I'm not asking out of curiosity. I know that too. Then why keep the promise now? Her expression softened. "Because she asked me to protect you until you were ready to understand it." Those words frustrated me more than silence would have. 35 years building bridges for the Army had taught me that every structure made sense once you found the original design. People weren't much different. Margaret always had a reason for everything. I simply hadn't found hers yet. Instead of arguing, I changed direction. "When did she make this quilt?" Ruth smiled faintly. "Which time?" I frowned. "What do you mean?" "Everyone thinks Margaret made one quilt." She shook her head. "She rebuilt it for nearly 30 years. That surprised me. Every repair meant something. Every new patch covered an older story. And every time someone in your family chose forgiveness over pride, another stitch was added." I stared at her. I thought those patches were repairs. They were. But they were also a record. She finally unfolded one corner of the quilt. Her finger stopped at the small embroidered bluebird. "Do you remember sewing this?" "No. You weren't supposed to. Margaret added it after your grandson Daniel ran away for 2 days when he was 16. I searched my memory. Daniel had returned safely. The family healed, Life continued. I had completely forgotten the incident. Ruth hadn't. Apparently, neither had Margaret. "The bluebird marks the beginning," Ruth whispered. "The beginning of what?" She looked toward the empty sanctuary before answering. "The letters." Without another word, she reached into her purse and removed an old church ledger. Its leather cover had cracked with age. Inside were neat handwritten entries stretching back decades. Quilt circle attendance, fabric donations, repair notes. Margaret's name appeared on nearly every page. Then one entry caught my eye. Blue patch added, "Family letter number 1 secured." The date matched the summer Daniel disappeared. I turned another page. Another entry. Letter number 2 added, "Different year, different family event." Again. 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 There weren't just 1 or 2 hidden letters. There were dozens. Each one tied to a moment when someone in our family chose compassion over resentment. I looked up slowly. "My God," Ruth nodded. "Your wife believed memories disappear, but written mercy survives." For several long moments, neither of us spoke. Then I asked the question that had quietly haunted me since Emily handed me those paper fragments. If there were dozens of letters, why are pieces missing? For the first time since I'd arrived, Ruth looked genuinely troubled. She closed the ledger, folded both hands across it, then answered in a voice barely above a whisper, "Because someone came here 2 weeks before Margaret died, asking where the quilt was kept." For a long moment, I couldn't make myself answer. Someone had been asking about Margaret's quilt before she died. Not after the funeral. Not during the confusion that follows every family's loss. Before. That changed everything. Until then, I had assumed whoever opened the hidden lining stumbled onto it by accident. Now another possibility emerged. Someone had been looking for the quilt because they believed something important was inside it. I leaned forward. "Did they tell you who they were?" Ruth shook her head. "They introduced themselves as one of your relatives." "Which relative?" "They never said. Man or woman?" "A man." She opened the church ledger again and slipped a faded photograph from between its pages. "I wasn't sure it mattered until yesterday." The picture had been taken nearly 20 years earlier during one of the church's annual quilting exhibitions. Margaret stood in the middle of the group, smiling with the quilt spread proudly behind her. Around her were 8 women from the sewing circle, several grandchildren, and a handful of visitors whose names I could no longer remember. Ruth pointed toward the lower corner. "Look carefully." At first, I noticed nothing unusual. Then my engineering habits took over. Whenever I inspected damaged bridges, I never looked for what stood out first. I searched for repeated patterns that didn't belong. One man in the photograph wasn't looking at the camera. He was looking at the quilt. His expression wasn't admiration. It was concentration. I turned the photograph over. Margaret had written every name in careful blue ink. Everyone was identified, except him. Only 2 words appeared beside the blank space. "Guest visitor." "Who was he?" I asked. Ruth sighed. "I honestly don't know. He stayed less than 15 minutes. But Margaret spoke with him afterward. Did she ever mention him?" "No." "What about the quilting circle?" "They assumed he was someone's cousin." The answer felt incomplete. So did the photograph. As I studied it again, another detail surfaced: the embroidered bluebird. It wasn't in this picture. That meant Margaret had sewn it onto the quilt after the exhibition, after meeting the stranger. A marker, not decoration. The timeline shifted in my mind, like a drawing suddenly viewed from the correct angle. The bluebird wasn't marking the first letter. It was marking the moment Margaret realized the letters might someday need protecting. I asked Ruth one final question. Did Margaret ever seem frightened? No. Concerned? Sometimes. About what? She said memories become vulnerable whenever people start measuring life by what can be sold. That sentence sounded exactly like Margaret. Practical, gentle, but impossible to ignore. Before leaving, Ruth handed me a small, spiral notebook wrapped in wax paper. I wasn't supposed to give you this until you asked the right question. I looked down. Margaret's handwriting covered the first page. Not instructions, just dates. Dozens of them. Each date matched one of the church ledger entries where another family letter had been stitched into the quilt. Near the final page, only one future date remained unwritten. 3 weeks away. The day of our annual family reunion. Nothing else appeared beneath it except a single sentence. Finish what love begins. I drove home without opening another page. That evening, I spread every family photograph I could find across the dining room table. One by one, I searched for the mysterious visitor. He never appeared again. But something else did. The bluebird. It wasn't only on the quilt. Margaret had quietly included that same tiny embroidered bird in several family photographs after the exhibition, always tucked into the background of holiday tablecloths, Christmas stockings, or picnic blankets. Not hidden. Waiting to be noticed. Then, just as I began arranging the photographs by year, my phone rang. Emily's voice came fast and uneasy. Dad, someone was in my attic today. I stood so quickly that my chair tipped backward. They didn't take the quilt. They didn't have time, but they left something behind. What? She took a shaky breath. A seam ripper, lying beside the folding table. By the time I reached Emily's farmhouse, the sheriff's deputy had already left. Nothing had been stolen. The attic window showed no signs of forced entry. The only object anyone couldn't explain was the seam ripper lying beside the quilt. Most people would have called it harmless. Margaret would have recognized it immediately. A seam ripper isn't used to repair a quilt. It's used to open one. Emily met me at the front door looking exhausted. I checked every room twice. I believe you. I locked the house before work. I believe that too. She stared at me for a long moment. Dad, do you think someone followed us from the funeral? I don't know. It was the most honest answer I could give. Upstairs, the quilt remained untouched exactly where we'd left it. The seam ripper rested beside the folding table, clean except for a few blue fibers caught beneath its tiny metal hook. I slipped it into a paper evidence envelope from my truck. Years of engineering inspections had taught me another habit, besides observation. Never contaminate what you don't yet understand. Emily watched quietly. I hate seeing you do that. Why? Because it means this is becoming real. It already was. I spread Margaret's notebook, the church ledger copies, and our old family photographs across the table. 3 separate records, 3 different decades. One repeating symbol, the bluebird. Every appearance came after the mysterious visitor attended the quilting exhibition. Every appearance also followed a difficult moment in our family. Daniel running away. My brother finally reconciling with our father. Emily forgiving herself after a failed business venture nearly cost her home. Margaret hadn't been recording happy occasions. She'd been marking moments when love survived disappointment. Then something else became impossible to ignore. The notebook contained 27 dated entries. The church ledger listed 27 hidden letters, but the photographs showed 28 bluebirds. One marker existed without a matching record. Someone had interrupted Margaret before she finished. I opened the notebook again. The final unwritten date, the family reunion. Below it, finish what love begins. Emily sat beside me. I think Mom knew she wasn't going to finish. So she left it for you? I slowly shook my head. No. For us. She looked confused. I turned another page toward the light. Indentations. No visible writing, just pressure marks left from words once written on the sheet above. I carried the notebook to the kitchen window. Late afternoon sunlight crossed the paper. Several faint impressions emerged. Not sentences. Names. Everyone belonged to someone in our family, each beside a number. 1 through 28. Margaret hadn't hidden letters randomly. Every letter had a recipient. A silence settled between us. Finally, Emily whispered, "She wasn't preserving the past. No. She was preparing the future." That realization hurt more than anything I'd discovered so far. Margaret had accepted that she would someday be gone. Instead of leaving a will full of explanations, she'd spent years creating something each person would receive, only when the family gathered together again. Then Emily suddenly covered her mouth. "Oh, Dad, what?" She pointed toward number 12. My name. Beside it, Margaret had written only 3 words. Read this last. I closed the notebook. Not because I lacked curiosity, because for the first time I understood what Margaret had trusted me to protect. Not the letters, the order. If even one recipient received the wrong letter too soon, the meaning of everything she'd built could unravel. Just then my phone buzzed. It was Ruth. Her voice sounded more urgent than I had ever heard. "Harold, they've found Margaret's quilting basket." I frowned. It was missing? I didn't realize it until today. Where was it? Hidden in the church basement. My grip tightened around the phone. What was inside? Ruth answered after a long pause. Nothing. They emptied it. Then she added the words that sent a chill through me. But whoever took everything left behind one envelope addressed only to you. I drove to St. Matthew's before sunrise. The church parking lot sat empty except for Ruth's aging sedan. Morning fog drifted across the cemetery behind the sanctuary, softening the rows of headstones until they looked almost unreal. Margaret used to say that dawn was the only time a church truly sounded alive, because every floorboard seemed to remember the footsteps of people who had prayed there. Ruth waited inside the quilting room. The empty wicker basket sat on the work table. For 40 years, it had carried Margaret's needles, thread, fabric scraps, and whatever project she happened to be stitching. Now only one cream-colored envelope rested at the bottom. My name filled the front in Margaret's familiar handwriting. Ruth quietly stepped toward the door. "I'll give you privacy." "No." I looked up. "Stay." Margaret trusted Ruth for a reason. If I opened this letter alone, I had a feeling I might misunderstand it the same way I'd misunderstood so many other things during the past week. I broke the seal carefully. Inside rested only a single folded page. No explanation. No accusations. Just Margaret's handwriting. "Harold, if you're reading this before the reunion, then someone has already started looking for what isn't theirs. Don't chase them. Protect everyone else instead." I stopped reading. The sentence felt almost unfair. Every instinct I possessed wanted to identify whoever had opened the quilt, searched the attic, and emptied this basket. Margaret wanted the opposite. Ruth watched my face. "She knew you'd hate that instruction." "She certainly did." I continued. "The letters were never hidden from our family. They were hidden for our family. People value money immediately. They usually recognize mercy much later. There was nothing else. No signature. No names. No clue pointing toward the mysterious visitor. Only trust." I folded the page and slipped it back into the envelope. Years in the Army had taught me something that civilian life kept trying to make me forget. Sometimes the mission changes before the objective does. Finding the person searching for the letters was no longer the mission. Making sure Margaret's plan survived was. That realization cost me more than I expected. Emily arrived 20 minutes later carrying the quilt inside a protective garment bag. "I brought fresh cotton gloves," she said. "I don't want anyone touching it with bare hands anymore." I smiled for the first time in days. Your mother would have approved. Together, the three of us examined the hidden lining again. This time we followed every stitched channel instead of focusing only on the damaged section. Near the lower border, beneath the final bluebird, Ruth noticed something neither Emily nor I had seen before. A second layer of stitching. Much finer, almost invisible. Margaret had divided the compartment. One side had held the family letters. The other contained something still hidden. Using a flashlight instead of a seam ripper, I traced the delicate thread until it reached a tiny hand-sewn knot. Untouched. Whoever searched the quilt had never found the second compartment. Emily whispered, "Do we open it?" I looked at Margaret's letter again. "Protect everyone else instead." "No." Both women stared at me. "We're leaving it exactly as it is." Emily looked almost frustrated. "What if the answer is inside?" "It probably is." "Then why wait?" "Because whoever has been searching believes they've already missed something." I carefully stitched a loose section closed with matching thread from Margaret's own sewing box. The repair wasn't as perfect as hers would have been, but it hid the compartment once again. Then I placed the quilt back inside its protective cover. If someone returned, I wanted them to think nothing had changed. Ruth slowly smiled. "So you've decided?" "I have." The reunion goes ahead exactly as Margaret planned. As we turned off the lights in the quilting room, I found myself asking one quiet question that had followed me since the funeral. How many families destroy the very inheritance they need most, simply because they open it before they're ready? Outside, I noticed a pickup truck pulling away from the far side of the church parking lot. Too far away to recognize the driver. Close enough to know someone had been watching. I didn't follow. For the first time since Margaret died, I wanted them to believe I had given up. The morning of our family reunion arrived with the kind of clear July sky Margaret always loved. By noon, children were chasing each other across the church lawn, folding tables filled with homemade food, and relatives who had not seen one another in years were exchanging stories beneath the old maple trees. To everyone else, it looked exactly like every reunion Margaret had organized for decades. Only 3 of us knew it wasn't. Emily carried the quilt inside its garment bag without a word. Ruth followed beside her with the church ledger tucked beneath one arm. I carried Margaret's notebook and the sealed envelope she had left for me. I acted as though the investigation had ended. That was the hardest part. About an hour into the afternoon, I noticed him. Not the stranger from the old photograph. Someone I already knew. My nephew, Brian. He had volunteered to help clean the fellowship hall after Margaret's funeral. He had also quietly disappeared twice during today's gathering, each time returning from the hallway leading toward the quilting room. Until that moment, I had never connected those details. Now I simply watched. Army engineering teaches patience better than confrontation. A bridge doesn't fail because you shout at it. It fails because every hidden weakness eventually reveals itself under enough weight. I decided to add a little weight. After lunch, I stood and thanked everyone for coming. Then I placed Margaret's quilt across the long family table. Conversation faded into silence. "I found something after your grandmother passed away," I said. "It belongs to every one of you." Brian's eyes moved immediately, not to me, but to the lower edge of the quilt. The bluebird. Exactly where the hidden compartment rested. He knew where to look. Without accusing anyone, I opened the church ledger first. Ruth read each entry aloud. Every repair, every blue patch, every family letter added after an act of forgiveness rather than resentment. Then Emily displayed the old photographs. One by one, the bluebirds appeared through the years, always after difficult moments our family had survived together. Confusion slowly turned into understanding. Finally, I unfolded Margaret's notebook. 28 names. 28 intended recipients. No one spoke. Brian suddenly cleared his throat. Aunt Margaret never mentioned any letters. "No," I answered calmly. "She didn't." His voice tightened. "So, how do you know they're really inside?" The question arrived too quickly. Too specifically. I met his eyes. I never said they still were. Color drained from his face. He looked toward the quilt again, toward the exact section someone had opened weeks earlier. Then Ruth quietly placed the cream-colored envelope beside me. The one Margaret left for Harold. I finally opened it in front of everyone. Inside wasn't another letter. It was a folded inventory written entirely in Margaret's careful handwriting. 28 names. 28 corresponding letter numbers. The final line read, "If any letter is missing, the church ledger, this inventory, and the quilt together will reveal exactly what was taken and what remains. Silence settled across the room. Brian lowered his head. I never meant to hurt anyone. No one interrupted him. He continued without looking up. I overheard Aunt Margaret telling someone the quilt held something more valuable than money. I thought she meant bonds, or deeds, or jewelry. So before the funeral, I tried to find it. He swallowed hard. I found one letter. I realized almost immediately it wasn't worth anything. What did it say? Emily asked softly. Brian's voice broke. It thanked me for helping Grandpa rebuild the porch after his surgery, and said she hoped I'd always choose people before possessions. Tears filled his eyes. I put it back. I couldn't remember exactly where. Everything finally fit. The damaged stitching, the missing fragments, the emptied sewing basket. The stranger had planted fear years earlier. Brian had acted on greed mixed with assumption. Margaret had anticipated both. No accusation was necessary. The evidence had spoken long before anyone confessed. As everyone stood quietly around the quilt, I reached for the unopened second compartment. Then I stopped. Not yet. Margaret had asked me to finish what love began now. It was finally time. I looked around the room before placing my hands on the final row of stitches. For the first time since Margaret's funeral, I wasn't searching for what had been taken. I was preparing to give something back. Ruth handed me Margaret's smallest quilting scissors. Instead of cutting through the seam, I loosened the tiny knot she had hidden beneath the last bluebird. The stitches slipped free exactly as she had intended decades earlier. Inside the second compartment rested 28 thin envelopes, each carefully numbered. Everyone was still there. A quiet breath swept through the room. Margaret had anticipated that someone might search the quilt for something valuable. She had hidden the real inheritance behind a second layer, trusting patience instead of locks. The first compartment had always been a lesson. The second had always been the gift. One by one, I called each family member forward. No speeches, no embarrassment, only a name, a smile, an envelope. Some cried before opening theirs. Others laughed softly as familiar memories returned from Margaret's handwritten words. Children listened while parents quietly read aloud stories they had never heard. My grandson Daniel wiped away tears after discovering the letter written after he came home as a frightened teenager, thanking him not for running away, but for finding the courage to come back. When Brian stepped forward, he could barely meet my eyes. I don't deserve one. I gently placed his envelope into his hands anyway. Neither do the rest of us. That's why your aunt wrote them. He opened it slowly. After reading only a few lines, he folded the letter against his chest and began to cry without hiding it. No one judged him. The consequences of his choices remained real, but so did the forgiveness Margaret had prepared years before. He later volunteered to restore every damaged stitch in the church quilting room under Ruth's guidance, honoring the trust he had nearly broken. At last, only one envelope remained. Number 12. Mine. I opened it after everyone else had finished. Margaret's handwriting felt as familiar as her voice. Harold, read yours last, because you've spent your whole life making sure everyone else crossed safely before you did. Now let them carry you for a while. When this quilt is no longer ours, it has finally become what we always hoped our family would be. I looked up. For the first time since losing her, the silence beside me no longer felt empty. Emily quietly spread the restored quilt across the center of the long family table. Children rested their hands on its patches. Grandchildren pointed at pieces of clothing they recognized from old photographs. The little bluebird that had once marked a hidden mystery now simply reminded us that love leaves quiet signs for those willing to notice them. Thank you for spending this time with me. If this story touched your heart, I'd be honored if you joined us again for another Quiet Valor story. Before you go, I'd love to hear from you. What family keepsake in your life carries memories that could never be replaced? Until next time, may your home be filled with grace, your memories remain a blessing, and may you never underestimate the quiet inheritance that love leaves behind.